Segment 5, the present predicament. Thomas Sowell on this program shortly before the election of 2008. This man, Barack Obama, really does believe that he can change the world, and people like that are infinitely more dangerous than mere crooked politicians.
Yes.
You were talking about candidate Obama. In what ways has President Obama surprised you?
None. He has followed policies which have ruined the economy. He has followed foreign policies that have emboldened our enemies. I can't imagine Iran trying to set off a bomb in the United States to kill a Saudi ambassador during the Reagan administration. You may recall that Iran had all those hostages under Jimmy Carter. They were released hours before Ronald Reagan took office. So it matters who the president is, and it matters how he comes across.
Despite President Obama's original plan, we still have troops in Iraq. Thank you, Iraq. He actually increased the number of troops we placed in Afghanistan. We still are using Guantanamo. Now, I don't deny for a moment that all of these are reversals for him, but he did reverse himself in these policies. And of course, we got Osama bin Laden on his watch. Don't you give him some credit for permitting
there's no need to. He takes the credit. You know, the special ops who went in there, they did the job. They learned where they had the information that led up to this over the years from having done these enhanced interrogations of people at Guantanamo that led to all this. And the fact that he happened to be there in the White House while they were making this raid in Pakistan really doesn't tell you an awful lot.
All right. Then if President Obama has not surprised you, has the rise, I back up. When we talked just before the election of 2008, I believe it was October, so it was even 3 years ago, you used the phrase the turning point, that we may be approaching a point of no return with Barack Obama. And since then, we have the rise of the Tea Party. Did that surprise you? Does that hearten you?
That did surprise me.
And how do you understand that?
Oh, I think that there have always been people out there who had those kinds of views, and they just didn't coalesce. And so that does mean that we have a chance next year of changing the direction of the country, restoring us some sanity in Washington.
So what Richard Nixon called the silent majority has found its voice?
Apparently.
Is that a fair?
Yes.
All right. Let me name a few names. People want to know what you think of certain people. I'll name a name. You tell me in a sentence or two. Well, far be it from me to delimit your answers. You tell me at any length you wish what you make of him. Rick Perry.
What I most liked about him was his saying the Republican Party cannot be all things to all people. Too many Republicans don't understand that. They think that you have to go out and cater to this group and that group. They ignore the fact that Ronald Reagan did not do that. He was the same person to everybody. And I doubt if even half the people who voted for him agreed with him on every single thing. But they saw him as being for real, and they knew what he stood for, and they thought that was going to be better for the country and for them.
So you have not written off Rick Perry. You fundamentally like that guy.
Yeah.
All right. Mitt Romney.
Mitt Romney is one of those people who is, he reminds me of a character in a movie called The Best Man, where there were two contestants for the party nomination, and they killed each other off. And in the final scene, not killed literally, in the final scene, there was this man, this bland-looking man, who gets on this escalator heading up because he's heading up there to be nominated for the presidency. And you know, I every time I see Mitt Romney, I think of that man. That he's this wonderful, bland fellow who hasn't offended anybody. And when the people who have principles knock each other off, he's the one who rises. I'm hoping that doesn't happen.
Let me push a little bit on that. That you have profound respect for the markets. Mitt Romney, he came from a wealthy family, but not an enormously rich family, and through his own work in the markets, Bain Capital, starting a number of enterprises, including nationwide operations now, such as Staples. He has amassed a fortune of more than $600 million, as I recall, is the last report. Isn't that an index of a certain level of skill and enterprise?
Absolutely, and I wish he would go back to doing that.
All right. And Herman Cain. What do you make of Herman Cain as a candidate?
Oh, I think he's a very good candidate. He may be the best candidate. The question is how would he be as president? And someone who has no political experience. The White House is not the place for on-the-job training, as our current president has illustrated.
All right. It's a little hard from those answers to deduce your favorite candidate. Rick Perry is your man at the moment, at least? Is that fair?
No, I think
you're open-minded at this point?
Yeah, I think that since we do have elections, and someone who can't win the election, regardless of what his potential as a president, the questions about his candidacy.
All right. When he was seated where you're seated just about 3 weeks ago, I asked Congressman Paul Ryan if he believed the country was doomed to a long period of decline, contention, bitter politics, or if instead of reaching a point of no return, we had the opportunity in the election of 2012 to reach a turning point. And here is Congressman Paul Ryan's reply.
So the way I see it is it's all about confidence and trajectory, which is, are we going to get the trajectory of our debt and our deficits under control so our economy can be free and so it can grow and prosper? Are we going to go back and implement those ideas that make us that opportunity society, that upward mobility society? And are we putting that plan in place? And are we confident that we're going to reach this trajectory? We will be confident if we change the structure of government, the structure of these programs that are the drivers of these debts. And that means we have to win an affirming election where the country gives us the authority and the obligation to do this. If we don't, if we go into this election with just a personality contest, muddling the differences, just speeding each other up, then it's going to be ugly afterwards, no matter who wins. And if we fail, then at least we tried. And so that's the way I see it.
That's actually hopeful. If we do put forward, if conservatives, if Paul Ryans of the world put forward a forthright, clear, distinct plan and win the election, the country can turn itself around. Are you more or less optimistic than Paul Ryan?
Oh, that's an if-then kind of statement. Yes, if that happens, then we can pull out of the nosedive and go on.
If we pull out of the nosedive, we can pull out of the nosedive. All right. So I put it to you in a tautological way. What do you think the chances are?
I don't know.
All right. I was kind of hoping for a little more optimism here, Tom, but no? All right. Listen, you conclude the Thomas Sowell Reader with some very sweet, moving, personal reflections. Quote, "My life has been a radical contrast with the lives of other black intellectuals. Perhaps most important," this was very striking to me, "perhaps most important, I grew up with no fear of whites." Why did you grow up without a fear of whites, and why has that proven so important to your intellectual life?
I think fear makes you have all sorts of sometimes irrational reactions to people. And I grew up, for example, obviously as a boy growing up in school, you get into fights and so forth. I grew up in the era of Joe Louis. Whenever I saw a white fighter fighting Joe Louis, he ended up on the floor, So that was one thing. And when I moved out of my school in Harlem to a school in a predominantly white school, obviously from having been in Harlem and having had to fight and so forth, I was a better fighter than most of the guys around. So I had no physical fear. And then when it came to intellectually, I still remember an episode that didn't seem that big at the time, but I think it was. The first time we had a math test, and I was in this class for kids with IQs of 120 and over. And the math professor said, a teacher said, I didn't think this was that tough a test for a class like this. And yet there was only one paper that had 100. And his name was, and he starts going through this thing, and he says, and his name was, and so I'm standing there, I says, Thomas Sowell. And he said, yes, that's the name. I was just being a wise guy. But I never had the condescension from my classmates after that.
You were a smart kid and you were a tough kid.
Yeah.
Okay. Again, I'm quoting from the Thomas Sowell Reader. "With all the vicissitudes of my life and the long years of living close to despair, Nevertheless, in retrospect, I can see that I was lucky in many ways. Close quote. The long years of close to despair, near despair.
I left home when I was 17 years old. And I learned out there in the marketplace that there was no great demand for high school dropouts with no skills and no experience. And there were times when I had trouble finding the money for food and for the rent money and so on. And I remember the lowest point, I remember walking from my where I lived in a rooming house on 142nd Street in Harlem to where I worked just below the Brooklyn Bridge.
Oh my goodness.
Because I did not have enough money.
That's 7 miles or so.
Yeah,
right.
yeah, to both ride the subway and buy food. And I preferred the food.
Lucky. In what ways have you been lucky?
Because I learned things that I couldn't have learned other ways. For example, there was no way I was going to live spending every dime I had thereafter. You know, I learned that people who are ordinary people knew far more than I did, even though they were not intellectuals. And even though I had read more books than they had and so forth and so on. And I spent several years like that. And so I never had this condescending attitude toward ordinary people that so many intellectuals have. You know, I realized those people know a hell of a lot. And they knew a hell of a lot more than I did about things that mattered. And I remember from that era, I finally reached the point where I had to ask the foreman to borrow some money from him because I
Foreman, what were you working at this time?
A machine shop down on the Lower East Side, and to borrow some money from me from him, so I could ride to work on the subway and eat at the same time, and he lent me $5. And one of the most wonderful experiences I remember since then, decades later, when I'm in New York on a book tour, I phone him and invite him to dinner with his family. And we had dinner up at the top of the World Trade Center.
Oh, how wonderful.
And we spent the time, and when we parted, he and I were both on the verge of tears, you know, and that was the last time I saw him.
Tom, final quotation from the Thomas Sowell Reader. The whole point of looking back on my life is to hope that others will find something useful for their own lives. Young American watching this program, 18, 19, 20, what advice do you have for someone who's just the age now that you were as a Marxist living on 130-something Street? Young American in 2011.
It depends on what his circumstances are. But I would say learn all you can before you reach conclusions. There are plenty of people out there who have prepackaged conclusions for you to reach. You need to build up a level of knowledge and experience so that you're no longer putty in the hands of somebody else who has his own agenda.
And let me alter the question just slightly. This really is the last question. If that young American is an African American, do you alter your advice?
No.
Tom Sowell, author of the Thomas Sowell Reader, thanks so much.
Thank you.
I'm Peter Robinson at Uncommon Knowledge. Be sure to join us, by the way, on our Facebook page at facebook.com/UNC-knowledge, facebook.com/UNC knowledge, and at our brand new web address, hoover.org/UK. Hoover with 2 O's.org/UK. Again, Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge. Thanks for joining us.